Today's video, we're going to be in Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. The disciples pick wheat on the Sabbath. So after the Pharisees and religious leaders see Jesus eat with the sinners at Matthew's house, and they see the disciples not fasting like they do, now they're going to be in full pursuit mode. They're looking for every reason they can to make Jesus look bad, to the point that they're even following him around everywhere he goes. So verses 1 through 5 in NLT Bible in chapter 6 says, "One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples broke off heads of grain, rubbed off the husks in their hands, and ate the grain. But some Pharisees said, 'Why are you breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?' Jesus replied, 'Haven't you read the scriptures, what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went to the house of God and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only priests can eat. He also gave some to his companions.' And Jesus added, 'The Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath.'" So as we break this down, verses 1 and 2 says, "On the Sabbath day, as Jesus walked through some grain fields, his disciples broke off heads of grain, rubbed off the husks in their hands, and ate the grain. But some Pharisees said, 'Why are you breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?'" So on the Sabbath day, Jesus was walking through some of these grain fields with his disciples. And just walking through, they willingly take off some heads of grain, rub it, and just eat it. And apparently some Pharisees that were following were watching their every move. Before they get into what the Pharisees start saying, some skeptics would say that they're stealing wheat. Not just eating, but they're also stealing this farmer's wheat. So God had a system put in place in the Old Testament where the farmers were to leave some crops for the poor people and for the visitors to eat. Deuteronomy 23:25 says, "And when you enter your neighbor's field of grain, you may pluck the heads of grain with your hand, but you must not harvest it with a sickle." So if you harvest it with a sickle, you're getting greedy. But if you're just hungry, you can pluck it with your hands and eat some. So the disciples were not guilty of stealing grain. But some Pharisees said, "Why are you breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?" So the Jewish tradition had 39 categories of activities forbidden on the Sabbath, and harvesting was one of them. The teachers of religious law went so far as to describe different methods of harvesting. One method was to rub heads of grain between your hands, and the disciples were doing this here. They were not breaking the Sabbath by doing their daily work on it. They may have been breaking the extra added rules that the Pharisees put in place, but they were not breaking any divine law, because Jesus was not going to allow them to break any kind of divine law. That way they could point out the flaws in Jesus, but he knew that this was a man-made law. As you go through the four Gospels, you're going to see a lot of opposition to Jesus on the Sabbath day. The Pharisees and religious leaders added several extra rules to make God's laws even better. But they didn't realize they were adding such a burden on the people that people probably hated the Sabbath day when it came. The Sabbath day was supposed to be for rest and a dedication to the Lord. And that was supposed to be a day of worship where people enjoyed that day. But the Pharisees made it a day of burdens. The shameful disciples were reaping, threshing, and preparing food, all on the holy day of rest. That's what the Pharisees were saying. "Why are you doing all this work?" So verses 3 and 4, Jesus replies, "Haven't you read the scriptures, what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went to the house of God and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priest could eat. He also gave some to his companions." The disciples acted, but Jesus took the responsibility. Jesus found scriptural proof for his defense in 1 Samuel 21:6. "Since there was no other food available, the priest gave him the holy bread, the bread of the presence, that was placed before the Lord in the tabernacle. It had just been replaced that day with fresh bread. So each week, 12 consecrated loaves of bread, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, would be placed on the table in the temple. This bread was called the bread of presence. After its use in the temple, it was to be eaten only by the priests. So Jesus, accused of Sabbath breaking, referred to a well-known story about David. David and his men were fleeing from Saul, and David and his men had eaten the sacred bread. Their need had been more important than the ceremonial regulations. Perhaps one could see David as the Lord's anointed qualified to be the nation's religious leader. They could have said, well, he was the leader of Israel at that time, but he also gave some to his companions. So that would show that he gave it to just common people. The book of Samuel defends this action on the grounds that they were entering a holy war battle and had sanctified themselves, but still they were not priests in the line of Aaron. So David simply put human need above ritual law. God's priests cooperated with him. So they cooperated with this. They knew they were hungry, but it was more important to feed the men than it was to obey this ritual law. And Jesus was appealing to the same principle. Human need is more important than human regulations and rules. By Jesus comparing himself and his disciples with David and his men, Jesus was saying, if you condemn me, you must also condemn David. Jesus was not condoning disobedience to God's law. Instead, he was emphasizing discernment and compassion in enforcing the law. So verse 5 says, and Jesus added, the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. When Jesus said he was Lord even over the Sabbath, he meant that he had the authority to overrule the Pharisees' traditions and regulations because he created the Sabbath. Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God, so he has every right to null and void their man-made rules. So what implications were behind this statement Jesus just made? The Pharisees surely did not miss the point. Only God could make such claim. Jesus, the Son of Man, identified himself also as the Son of God with divine authority. Such an authority makes the law and cannot be accused of breaking it. So in conclusion, Jesus said in Matthew 12:7, I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices. Our heart attitude towards God comes first. Only then we can properly obey and observe religious regulations and rituals. The Pharisees were following Jesus and his disciples around looking for every opportunity to call him out on something they observed of being wrong. But in fact, Jesus was the creator. He knew all God's laws perfectly because he wrote them. He knew what the disciples could do and what they couldn't do. He was pointing out another flaw that the Pharisees had. They knew only oral tradition, not God's sovereign law. Like I said, they added things to God's law to try to make themselves better, and it actually made them worse. So don't get caught up in man-made traditions, because these traditions throughout time mask the real reason why God made the law. If the tradition is not biblical, then be careful how you follow it. And that's the main thing is, don't follow man-made laws. Don't appease man, appease God. Do what's right, do what's in the Bible, and don't follow some of these religious traditions that are out there. Because as you see here, the Pharisees tried to call out Jesus on it, and Jesus, knowing all and knowing the truth, calls them out for them misleading people and making God's day, God's holy day, a burden towards other people. And there's a lot of religion in Christian people out there that point out flaws in people like that. They make it so burdensome that they push people away from the church. But don't be this type of person. Come to people with compassion. Stick to the Bible and try not to follow these man-made traditions. Amen.